Thank you, John. Ladies and gentlemen, after 7 years of crisis, the EU is not in great shape at all. That holds particularly for the Eurozone. We are suffering from weak growth, very high divergences in GDP growth in the EU, particularly in the Eurozone. We have subdued inflation, currently negative in the Eurozone, minus 0.6% in January. And if you combine weak real GDP growth and very low inflation, this means we're suffering under very low nominal GDP growth. Nominal GDP growth is way too low to accelerate the process of deleveraging, which means that Europe, for the time being and for many years to come, will suffer under a hefty debt burden, both the public sector and the private sector. Perhaps worse, we suffer under a very high, structurally high rate of unemployment. It's 11.5% in the Eurozone, but it masks significant differences within Europe, 24% and more in Spain, even higher rates of unemployment in Greece. If you combine this whole picture, it's clear that Europe is facing not just an economic challenge, a social challenge, it's a political challenge, not to use the word crisis. Now, for the EU, this means that the long-term economic and political success is in question, if not to say at risk. And a lot worse, for the Eurozone, it means that the integrity of the monetary union is at risk. We see this once again these days around the difficult negotiations with Greece. Now, the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis have hit the EU banking sector particularly hard, particularly in the Eurozone. And this has caused major trouble and damage for the EU economy for two reasons. First of all, because the banks are the key source of corporate funding in Europe. And secondly, because the banking crisis has hit the SME sector particularly hard in Europe. SMEs, many of them in the periphery, have been cut off from funding, which has been extremely damaging if you consider that SMEs make up for 60% of the value added in the EU and almost 2/3 of the employment. However, to tackle these problems, EU leaders came together at the darkest hour of the crisis in June 2012 to launch the project of the banking union, and this project has made very good progress since. So the aim was to break the vicious circle between banks and the sovereigns. As I said, we have seen major steps forward in this regard. The ECB has conducted this asset quality review and stress test over the course of last year. The results of this test have been released in late October. On the 4th of November, the SSM, the Single Supervisory Mechanism, was launched, which for the first time puts the ECB in a dominant position as the Eurozone banking regulator. Additional steps will follow. In 2016, we'll have a resolution mechanism and a resolution fund. And all combined, this means that the banking union project has now made major progress that should contribute to the healing of the Eurozone crisis. However, Europe must not stand still. The next big thing is now the Capital Markets Union, the focus of our conference today. The aim of the Capital Markets Union is twofold. First of all, we need to establish alternatives to bank funding, with a particularly focus on the securities markets. Now, Yves Mersch, executive board member of the ECB, put it pointedly in a speech last year when he said that the Eurozone economy is like a plane flying on just one engine, which is bank credit. And to increase the stability and the speed of the plane, it would be very good to have a second engine, which should be capital markets financing. Now you can see in this chart, this is corporate borrowing in the Eurozone. You see that the bulk of the corporate funding comes from loans, from bank credit, whereas the securitization part is only a small part. All combined, bank loans have a share of roughly 70-75% of the corporate funding. In contrast, in the US here, corporate funding in the US, we see that bank credit is just a small part. The dominant part of corporate funding comes from the capital markets. The share of bank credit is just 25 to 30%, a huge difference. And as I said earlier, with particularly the SME sector being so dependent on bank funding, this meant that the damage that the sovereign and banking crisis has had in Europe was so deep. Now, the second aim of the Capital Markets Union is to create a more efficient and growth-friendly and fully integrated capital markets in Europe. Now, it's a big paradox that more than 22 years after the launch of the EU single market in early 1993, we still do not have fully integrated capital markets in Europe. As one observer put it, it's a hodgepodge of national laws, rules, regulations, and business practices. And these are causing multiple fragmentation in Europe. Just to name a few, differing contract laws, insolvency laws, the huge area of taxation, payments and security settlement systems, also the cross-border exchange of information, all of this needs to be tackled. The Economist magazine, in its article on the Capital Markets Union last weekend, said it takes 28 to tango. So a lot of work needs to be done here across the EU. But one of the issues we'd like to promote here today is that we hope that others will be invited to tango as well, not just 28, but also the EU's partners going forward. Now, quantifying, estimating exactly what the upside would be is very difficult. But we believe the upside of a capital markets union for the depth and the size of the European capital markets could be very substantial. Now, what you see here is the securities markets in US dollar and in euro-denominated securities. You can see in the US, the markets are about 35 trillion and higher, whereas in the EU, 16, 17 trillion. There's a massive change in the size, obviously. Also, in terms of GDP, you cannot see this properly. It's 206% of GDP and more in the US, whereas in Europe, the share in GDP of the securities market is around 128. So massive upside that Europe should be able to capture if it were able to grow its securities market as large as the potential in the US suggests. Now, more specifically, we see here the EU size in blue in a number of markets, like the corporate ABS market, the convertibilities market, follow-on, so secondary market offerings, IPOs, high-yield bonds, investment-grade bonds, and so on. You can see the size of the market in the EU in blue, and the brown part shows you the potential size of the EU markets if these subsegments of the capital markets were as big as in the US as a share of GDP. So obviously, the chart here on the right suggests substantial potential for growth in the future, a potential that we need to try to capture. Because in the end, better funding should imply better investment, and better investment should imply stronger growth. And what we all need here in Europe is stronger growth. My final point would be, for me, the asset test, and perhaps the highest hurdle for the Capital Markets Union would be to improve the access of SMEs to funding. Perhaps not small companies, but medium-sized companies in particular. The fate of these companies when it comes to corporate market access should be greatly improved. If we were to manage that with the Capital Markets Union, I think it would be a huge step forward. Now, with that, I thank you and hand it over to Oliver Adler, Chief Economist at Credit Suisse.